The military-industrial complex controls America. Trump, Biden, Obama, Bush, radically different from each other, but they all have one thing in common. All these presidents have perpetuated this state of permanent war and continued to feed the unquenchable thirst of the military-industrial complex. America now spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined, 8 of which are allies. How did America come under the influence of the military-industrial complex? How is it that this permanent defense industry maintains control over the political system? And are we falling into another trap to keep us in forever war? Let's discuss in this video. Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos and hit that bell notification while you're at it. The rise of the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex is the network of vested interests, the Pentagon, the defense industry, lobbyists, think tanks, and politicians that benefit from the excessive production of weapons and the state of permanent war in the United States. Before World War II, American war efforts were supported by independent industry. This changed under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the establishment of the War Production Board. This cooperation between government and the defense industry and the massive production capacity that came with it was necessary in order to win the total war against the Axis powers. But when the war ended, the massive production capacity of the defense industry was not dismantled. Instead, the massive production capacity was repurposed to fight the rising threat of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The close relationship between government and the defense industry stayed intact, and while America was at peace, the wartime economy remained. By the 1950s, it was clear that America had developed a permanent defense industry and a permanent network of lobbyists to keep it all going. Already in 1961, as he left office, President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about the rising political influence of the military-industrial complex.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Eisenhower's words would prove to be fateful, but they fell on deaf ears. Throughout the Cold War, America produced an untold number of nuclear missiles, aircraft carriers, jet fighters, and tanks to fight a war with the Soviet Union that never came. And then, on Christmas Day 1991, it all came crashing down when Mikhail Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The military-industrial complex was built to fight the Cold War, and suddenly it was over. Suddenly, the United States was left without an enemy to fight. Suddenly, the Pentagon and the defense contractors could no longer justify their jobs or their oversized budgets. So they had to create an enemy. In the 90s and 2000s, that enemy was the war on terror, rising Islamic fundamentalism, Iran and Russia. And now that enemy is China. So how does the military-industrial complex work? War is a racket. The defense industry is not like other industries. Other industries have many buyers and many sellers and open competition. But in the defense industry, you have a handful of companies producing for only one customer, the Pentagon. An entity which relies on spending other people's money. And the way to influence a customer like the government is not necessarily by creating cheaper or more innovative products. You influence government by creating a permanent network of lobbyists to influence the decision makers who get to decide which defense projects to fund. You create a media apparatus to feed people with fear and convince them that terrorism, Iran, or China are an immediate threat, and even more money is required to defeat them. More fear, more war, more profit. That's not to say that there aren't real threats in the world, but it's about what is proportional. In 2019, America spent $732 billion on the military. That's half of the discretionary budget and 15% of the total. America now has a larger military budget than the next 10 nations combined, and only 2 of them, Russia and China, can actually be considered enemies. We cannot pretend that there is a military threat so large that requires this level of spending. Russia has an economy slightly larger than Spain, but with nukes. Their entire military budget is smaller than the $85 billion the US spends on intelligence alone. China's military budget is a third that of the United States. There is no way to justify this military budget. When the Pentagon was finally audited in 2018, not only did the audit itself cost $400 million, but it failed its first audit, and the second one in 2019, and the third one in 2020. War is a racket, and you're not in it. So how does this system remain in place? Warfare is welfare. In America, the word welfare has a negative connotation associated with lazy people on unemployment benefit. But the real welfare queen is not poor people, it's the defense industry. And the real welfare program is not unemployment benefit, but the military. Part of the reason that the lobbying efforts of the defense industry are so successful is because defense contractors have strategically located their industries in every congressional district in the country. This means that every congressperson has constituents who, directly or indirectly, work in the defense industry. And so an army of aggressive lobbyists can keep congresspeople in line by threatening them with job losses in their district if they dare propose a reduction in defense spending. And no politician wants that. This is why you see that even many progressive politicians like Elizabeth Warren, whose social welfare programs require cutting military spending in order to be affordable, still end up voting for more military spending, even when it was clear that the law was going to pass anyway. And it's not just defense contractors who engage in lobbying. Foreign countries also lobby for the approval of arms contracts. In 2017, Saudi lobbyists booked over 500 rooms in Trump's hotels, and in 2018, the Trump International Hotel in New York saw a 13% increase in revenue after Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stayed there. So then it's not surprising that Trump went on to approve a $110 billion weapons deal with Saudi Arabia and vetoed the bill to end the war in Yemen. The next aspect of welfare is the military itself. America has a very underdeveloped welfare state. They don't even have free university education or universal healthcare. But if you work for the military and you put your life at risk to feed the permanent war machine, I mean defend your country, you get free university education, subsidized housing and childcare, and free universal healthcare for the rest of your life. This provides a massive incentive for people from working class backgrounds to join the military and keep the war machine going. The demand for weapons also creates an artificial demand for war that needs to be justified in the public discourse. Control the media. What many people don't realize is that many of these so-called experts that you see on TV talking about foreign affairs are in fact lobbyists for the defense industry. This fact is mostly conveniently left out by the media, and the media itself plays a crucial role in ginning up the fear and false patriotism necessary to keep people ready for war. In the run-up to the Iraq War, few mainstream media outlets openly questioned the flimsy narrative of weapons of mass destruction used to justify the illegal invasion of the country, and anybody who did was sidelined. Unsurprisingly, defense contractors purchased a massive amount of advertising from media companies, who depend on ad revenue to remain profitable, and no one bites the hand that feeds them. But it isn't just the mainstream media that does this. At the policy level, there is a network of think tanks with reputable names that all come to the conclusion that the world is more dangerous than it was before, and that we therefore need more spending and more US presence abroad. Of course, the people in these think tanks often rotate between being defense contractors or working in the military itself in one big revolving door. And so you have a media and policy ecosystem that never question the narrative of forever war or the bloated military budgets. But there are also more subtle ways to influence the public. The military entertainment complex is a term used to describe the joint effort between the military and the entertainment industries to bring a positive light onto the military. A few examples of this are video games based in wartime, such as Call of Duty, and movies like Top Gun, which was a collaboration with the Pentagon. These efforts tend to romanticize military service and are an alternative tool for military recruitment. And so even at the level of entertainment, the idea that America is the world's savior and that its foreign interventions are somehow justified is inculcated into the population. But many of you were already smart enough to know this, and by now just 17% of Americans still support the failed war in Afghanistan. The real problem is that we are in danger of being played by the military-industrial complex once again. A manufactured threat. With support for the war on terror and interventions in the Middle East at an all-time low, the military-industrial complex needs a new menace to feed its insatiable appetite. That new enemy is China. The military-industrial complex was built for a Cold War with an aggressive superpower, not endless guerrilla warfare with local insurgents. And so the push for a Cold War with China is like a gift sent from heaven. So let's critically analyze this. The United States has 20 times as many nuclear warheads as China, twice the tonnage of warships at sea, 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers compared to China's 2, which are less advanced, 800 overseas bases compared to China's 3, and a $750 billion budget compared to China's $250 billion. If China was part of NATO, it would be reprimanded because it spends below the 2% requirement. The Chinese threat is manufactured in part to justify increased military budget. A Cold War with China will allow the defense industry to raise endless amounts of money to fight a war that will probably never happen because of nuclear deterrence and economic interdependence. It's not that China isn't trying to reassert itself or that it isn't threatening its neighbors. Just ask Taiwan. But it's worth putting things into perspective. The United States literally has China surrounded and has military capabilities many times larger. It's not like China is in our backyard. The equivalent would be if Chinese troops were in Cuba, Mexico, and Canada, and Florida was a breakaway state allied to China. The British Empire used the rule of thumb that its navy had to be larger than the next 2 put together. US military spending is larger than the next 10 countries put together, 8 of which are allies. The Chinese are gaining influence not because they spend more than us, but because they are smarter than us. While the US wasted $1.7 trillion to develop the failed F-35 fighter jet, the Chinese will have spent a similar amount on the Belt and Road Initiative to build infrastructure in over 70 countries around the world. China is not doing this for charity, but to gain influence. But ask yourself, which is money better spent? America could very easily fund its own Belt and Road Initiative, but it doesn't. Is it any wonder then that countries are turning to China? China is building countries, America is bombing them. The US doesn't need to spend more, it needs to spend smarter. It doesn't need to buy more tanks that will never be used to fight China. It needs to expand its economic influence and focus on those areas where it can get the best value for money. While the US wastes money on outdated and expensive aircraft carriers, other countries are developing missiles that can destroy those aircraft carriers for a fraction of the cost. While the US wastes money on expensive fighter jets that will only end up bombing people in caves, Russia and China are developing cyber warfare capabilities that could shut down the US power grid, something which is far cheaper and far more destructive. I'm not here to pretend that China isn't a threat at all, but let's not exaggerate. And if we must confront China in a new Cold War, at least do it smart and cheap. The next Cold War will not be fought with tanks, ships or bombs, but with cyber warfare, drones and economic influence. Part of the reason the US is so dependent on its military is because it has neglected all the other tools of geopolitical influence. Even as military budgets soared, the US neglected its diplomatic corps. Rather than appointing professionals, of the 217 ambassadorships under Obama, 31 were given to people who were big money donors and another 39 to political appointees. And this practice is common, not just Obama. A large part of geopolitical influence is not simply the hard power of tanks and bombs, but the soft power of diplomacy, multilateral institutions, and economic influence. China realizes this, and that's why it spends so much of its energy on expanding its economic influence, vaccine diplomacy, and building Chinese cultural institutions abroad. But more than anything, the real losers of the system are the American people themselves. Every dollar spent on enriching defense contractors is a dollar not spent on healthcare, education, or infrastructure. The consequence is that 40,000 Americans are dying every year because they don't have healthcare. The infrastructure is falling apart, and for the first time ever, life expectancy is going down. And that was before the coronavirus. These are the things that the United States should focus on, but they are not profitable for the military-industrial complex, and so they are neglected. As Eisenhower said, every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed. To find out how the campaign finance system in America works, check out this video. Leave a comment for the algorithm. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe. 'Cause this was my take.